The behavior chain, why we do what we do. We have an event that goes to a trigger, some kind of trigger that will trigger us in some response. Then we have a thought that goes to a feeling and in turn to an action, and then our actions have consequences. So let's go through these because ultimately we want to come out with a consequence which is empowering rather than disempowering. Often when an event happens, anything happens around us, it will trigger us in some regard. That trigger will lead to thought. Now, whether we are aware of that thought or not, nonetheless, it's a thought that we can either capture or it's ignored. That then will lead to a feeling, which in turn is either identified, we understand what the feeling is, or we're completely unaware of it, which will lead to an action. And again, we can be intentional with our actions or they just come automatically. And then that brings the consequence. And whether the consequence is empowering or disempowering all depends on what happens from the event through to the trigger down thought, feeling, action, and consequence. Ideally, we don't want to end up in a disempowering place as a consequence. And that's really a whole series of events have happened if we end up with a disempowerment. Potentially, our actions have led to automatic responses that has led to a consequence that was disempowering. Now, even if our action was a powerful action, but we've been unaware and ignorant of our thoughts and our feelings, the ultimate area of our actions tend to just be automatic and our consequences can be disempowering. Where we want to be is we want to be able to go from an empowering process of captured thoughts, identified feelings, and intentional actions. And so the consequences are very empowering because we have a full engaged aspect of all of these events. Now, it can be that you've been triggered by an event, you've had a thought, but you weren't aware of that thought because the first thing that you became aware of was actually the feeling from the trigger. So the thought process was unaware and you've identified it and therefore you've taken the right action, which is empowering. So you can break this loop, break this pattern, but eventually you want to be able to work all the way back so that you can capture the thoughts, because ultimately it all starts with our thoughts. Now, even if you walk all the way down and your thoughts lead to being ignored, they turn to feelings and you haven't been aware of those feelings and it's just led straight to an action and it's a knee-jerk, but you've paused and it hasn't moved to an automatic action, but instead you've intentionally moved to say, oh, I'm sorry, or that's a response that I didn't want to have, and you've been able to capture it there. However, what needs to go on further is you need to be able to work back and say, well, how come I wasn't aware of those feelings? How come I ignored those thoughts? Because they were there. I hope you've been able to see this behavioral chain, and this is why we do what we do. Let's move in an empowering way as we move forward.